She came west with a bag and a contract. But the man who'd paid for her didn't want a wife. He wanted someone to remind him he was in charge. And when he finally pushed too far in his own kitchen, she gave him an answer that silenced the whole room. Option B, shock opening. Albert Pugh asked his wife about her cooking every single day. Not because he cared how the food tasted. He asked because he needed her to feel small. And for 2 years, she let him. Until one Tuesday night, she didn't. Option C, story plunged. The night Willa finally answered Albert honestly, he packed his things before dawn. Not because she was wrong. Because she was right. And he couldn't live with a woman who knew it. Willa arrived on the afternoon coach from the railhead, the last passenger off, carrying a single bag. She was 23 years old. 3 years out of the orphanage where she'd grown up and stayed on, taking in mending, saving what she could, waiting for something that looked like a future. When the solicitation came from a man named Albert Pugh out in the Wyoming Territory, she read it twice. Signed her name. Spent the last coin she had on the ticket. Albert Pugh was waiting at the far end of the platform. 36 years old. A rancher with decent land and a reputation for keeping to himself. He'd filed the contract 8 months prior. He'd spent the time since changing his mind. But he hadn't written a letter. A letter would have required courage he did not have. So he let her travel 3 weeks. Let her spend every saved penny. And then he told her standing on a platform in front of half the town. I can't go through with it. Loud enough to carry. That was the whole of the cruelty, because the platform wasn't empty, and by supper half the town would know, and by morning the rest would. Willa stood and let him finish. Hands at her sides. Her face doing what she needed it to do. He waved the agency papers once. Not a deed. Everyone on that platform knew a woman was in land, but he held them like a man who wanted the weight of paper behind him. And then he put them back in his coat and walked away without looking back. The platform cleared around her. She remained. Bag at her feet. The town spread out in front of her and no clear answer to what came next. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware store. Seth Callan. 32. Broad in the shoulder. Carpenter's hands. Sawdust on his sleeve from the morning. He looked like a man who had carried too much for too long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight. He stood on the step and read the platform. The bag. The straight back. The empty space where a man had just been. Then he crossed the street. Seth Callan, he said. I've got 2 children and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week, so mornings you'd have the place to yourself. He held her gaze. It's temporary. Room and board until you've sorted what's next. She looked at him for a moment. Taking the measure of the man. Can you cook? He said. She met his eyes. I can. And I'm not afraid of hard work. She picked up her bag. Then let's go. The cabin sat at the edge of town with a horse in the side pen and a porch step that had been meaning to be attended to. She noted it without comment. Inside, the front room was clean in the way of a house managed by a man alone, functional, orderly, with nothing soft in it. A workbench along the far wall. A stove doing its steady work. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. It had the look of something no one had touched in a long time. Something everyone in the house had quietly agreed to leave alone. Jack came from the rear of the house with the timing of a boy who'd been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 10 years old. His father's build already in the shoulders. A face that kept its own counsel. He looked at Willa the way a person looks at something they've seen a version of before and aren't ready to feel differently about. He looked at his father. Then he turned and went back the way he came without a word. Which said plenty. Mary didn't make an entrance so much as she materialized. 6 years old. One ribbon tied properly and one simply hanging. Standing near the bedroom doorway with the full and unguarded attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to want things quietly. She looked at Willa with her whole face. "Are you hungry?" Willa said. Mary considered this seriously. "A little bit. Come help me find what's in the larder." Mary came without hesitation. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread and a broth that had no business smelling the way it did given what the larder held. The smell reached the front room before anyone sat down. Seth came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face that he set aside. Jack ate quietly. Mary ate with her eyes moving between her bowl and Willa in steady rotation. Partway through the meal, Mary set her spoon down. The last woman who kept house for us burned everything she touched. Seth said her name. A warning. But Mary looked at Willa instead. She did, though. "Burnt beans are a serious matter," Willa said, eyes on her plate. "I don't take them lightly." Jack looked up. The corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. He said nothing more, but when supper was finished, he stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to before going to bed. Seth noted that without comment. And then the trouble came. It started the way trouble in small towns always starts, with someone saying something they thought was harmless. Dale Marsh was at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, talking the way men talk at the end of a long day. Easy. Unhurried. He said the Callan place looked different lately. Smoke at the right hours. The children seemed steadier. That woman from the platform, the one Albert had left standing there in front of half the town. Something about her, Dale said. The kids have taken to her like I haven't seen before. Older ones coming around. Younger ones started calling her Mama. He reached for his glass. Albert had gone still at the end of the bar. Dale kept talking. Not noticing. Said it was good to see that house with some life in it again. Albert looked at the row of bottles across from him. He had the agency papers in his coat. He had a pride that had sat wrong since the platform. And now there was a picture forming in his head, warm light in the windows. Children settled. Smoke at the right hours. A woman the children had already begun to call Mama. He set coins on the bar and stood up. "Where does Callan live?" he said. It was a Thursday morning, cold and clear, when Albert stepped into the middle of the street with the agency papers in his hand and his voice pitched to Carrie. "The fare was paid," he said. "The contract signed. An obligation doesn't dissolve because a woman has found somewhere more comfortable to be." He held the papers up like a deed. though everyone on that street knew what they actually were. Then he used the word his. And the street heard it land. Everything slowed. A woman near the dry goods stopped walking. Two men outside the feed store turned. The cold air held everything in place. Willa stood beside Seth. She did not step back. She did not look at Albert. She held herself the way she'd held herself on the platform, still, straight, not finished, except that this time there was someone standing next to her, and the whole street could see that he had not moved. Seth looked at the papers. He looked at Albert. Then he turned to Willa. His voice low and even. Stay here. Not a command. The way you speak to someone you are coming back to. He walked to the bank. For minutes inside, he came back with money he had kept under the floorboards for 2 years. Everything set aside toward buying back into a proper ranch. The slow and patient work of a man rebuilding from the ground up. He crossed the street and pressed it into Albert's hand and held it there until Albert's fingers closed around it. That settles the fare, the fee, and every excuse you rode in with. His voice was flat and final. It does not buy her. It frees her from you. Now go. Albert looked at the money. He looked at the street looking at him. He looked once at Willa, and whatever he found in her face was not what he'd ridden into town for. He walked to his horse and rode out. And the cold morning closed behind him. If you're still here, you're the kind of person who believes the truth always wins even when it takes its time. Hit subscribe and the bell. These stories drop every week, and the next one might hit even harder. Now, here's the part the title promised. And it happened before the street. Before the money. Before any of it. 2 weeks after Willa moved in, Albert came to the cabin. Not to reclaim her, not yet. He came because he'd heard she was cooking for Seth Callan's children. And the question he asked was not about food. He stood on the porch and looked past Seth into the kitchen where Willa was kneading bread, and he said, loud enough for her to hear, "Can she even cook? Or is that just what people are saying?" It was a small thing. A throwaway line. The kind of comment a man makes when he wants to diminish without leaving a mark. He was asking about cooking the way a man asks about anything a woman does, not because the answer matters, but because the question itself is supposed to remind her where she stands. Willa appeared in the doorway. Flour on her hands. Face calm. "You want to know if I can cook, Albert?" She held his gaze like she'd held it on the platform. "I can. I've been feeding 2 children and a man who works with his hands since the day you walked away. Nobody's gone hungry. Nobody's complained." She wiped her hands on her apron slowly. "But that's not what you're asking, is it? You're asking if I'm worth anything. And the truth is, I wasn't worth anything to you. You paid for me and you left me standing in the cold because you didn't have the stomach to send a letter. So don't stand on my porch asking about my cooking. Ask yourself why you're still thinking about a woman you threw away." Albert stared at her. The porch went quiet. The wind moved through the yard. He left without another word. And that was the answer that ended the marriage before it ever really was one. Not because she was cruel. Because she was honest. And in a place where women were expected to endure quietly, honesty was the most brutal thing of all. The street held its breath. Seth turned, not to the crowd. To her. She was already looking at him. Hands at her sides. The exhaustion she'd carried since the platform was gone from her eyes. Something steadier had taken its place, the look of a woman standing on ground that holds. He stood in front of her. The wind came off the hills between them, clean and cold. He had crossed a street before he'd decided to. He had left coffee on a counter and made nothing of it. He had just handed 2 years of savings to another man without pause, because standing by while she was taken was not something he was able to be. He was not a man who dressed things up finer than they were. And he was not going to start now. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "As my wife, if that's what you want." She looked at this man. And she took the space that choosing for herself required. And nobody hurried her. And the cold street waited. "Yes," she said quietly and completely, with nothing held back. "That's what I want." He let out a long, slow breath. And his hand found hers and closed around it. Jack was at the table with a short length of wood in his father's smallest plane, working the edge down by feel, the tip of his tongue between his teeth. Mary was on the floor with her rag doll, deep in some matter of considerable importance that didn't require adult involvement. From the stove came the smell of something with molasses, a new thing Willa was working out, adjusting as she went. The kind of smell that gets into the walls of a kitchen and stays there for years. The door opened. Cold air and then Seth's boots on the step. The sound of a man who knows his coming home is expected and has stopped taking that for granted. Mary raised the ragdoll briefly in his direction by way of greeting and returned to her business. Jack looked up at his father in the doorway. Then he looked back down at the plane and kept working. The looking had carried something in it that had not been there at the start of things. Seth hung his coat, crossed to the stove, and stood beside Willa and looked at what was on it. She moved the spoon toward him without a word. He tasted it and considered it quietly and without rushing. Then he looked at her. She took the spoon back. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth moved. And that was the story of Willa, a woman who arrived with nothing but a bag and a spine, and left with everything that actually matters. She didn't win by being loud. She won by being honest in a world that never asked her to be. If this one hit you, drop a comment and tell me, what would you have said to Albert on that porch? I read every one. Subscribe if you haven't. The next story's already burning. Thank you.